Aussie Street is a window into the shared history of ordinary Australia, with lessons for dealing with challenging futures. It's highlighted for me the power of storytelling to elicit positive change. So I hope Aussie Street will inspire you to dive deeper into the opportunities to retrofit your home, garden, household and neighbourhood. These 4 east-facing houses on quarter-acre blocks are an iconic microcosm of the golden age of growth and improvement in Australia following the difficult decades of the Great Depression and the Second World War. Aussie Street is typical of many suburban subdivisions created on the fringes of our capital cities and regional towns to house families, including many returned servicemen and women, as well as migrants. These were the places where the vast majority of the baby boom generation were raised. My experience growing up during those years in suburban Bicton, WA, strongly informed Aussie Street, but its details are more modelled on Melbourne's northern and western suburbs. But many of you will recognise your neighbourhood and residents in the story. So let's get to know the residents of Aussie Street. Fred and Hilda are a married couple with no kids living at number 1. Fred's unmarried sister Ethel shares the house and is a volunteer secretary in the local Catholic parish. Fred is a printing press worker at the Herald Sun newspaper and drives to work each day in his new sky blue FJ Holden, which is parked in the garage when he's not working on projects. Both the car and the workshop are as clean as Hilda's kitchen. Fred also maintains a seasonal veggie garden down the back, while Hilda grows tulips out the front and tends her beloved Barnevelder chooks. She actually comes from Barnevelder. They met in the aftermath of the Second World War. Effectively, she was a refugee, and Fred brought his young bride back home. Her washing on the Hills Hoist clothesline is always spotless. Harold and Marge are a married couple with kids Graham, Lucy and Gerald, who were all born in the local hospital. Harold is a clerk in Myer department store and with his staff discount is the first in the street to buy a TV. Actually, the neighbours came over when he first got it to watch the test pattern on in the afternoon. Outside there are many of the same things as next door, the car and the carport, the veggie garden and the fruit trees down the back, the Hills Hoist and the ornamental front garden. But Harold's not practical like Fred, and Marge has her hands full maintaining domestic standards with 3 kids to look after. She mostly manages by sending them outside to play in the yard or on the street and look after baby Gerald. Sid and Sue live at number 3 with their tribe of 5 kids, Brian and his sisters, plus a Doberman dog that is constantly digging up what little garden and lawn there is. Sid is a backyard mechanic, and Sue is the only woman in Aussie Street, or at least this part of Aussie Street, with a driver's licence. Brian sleeps on the back veranda and his sisters share the bedrooms. Sue and the kids regularly visit their folks, her folks, on a soldier settler farm in the sticks. To bring a bit of the farm back to town, she plants a gum tree in the backyard. Now, on one of Sue's visits away, Marge next door sees Sid pashing with a young female customer and thinks she should tell Sue, but doesn't get around to it. Mario and Angela are from Sicily. They bought number 4 after living in an ex-army migrant camp for several years. They have 3 kids. The oldest, Dino, acts as an interpreter for his mother when she has to go to the doctor. Mario and Angela both ride their bicycles to the shoe factory, where they regularly do double shifts. Mario has the largest veggie garden and orchard in the street, as well as pigeons and rabbits. Now, Marge, down at number 2, complains about his pigeons shitting on her washing. Out the front, where you would expect an ornamental garden, they have an olive grove and strange herbs. Oh, and there's a goat tethered in the backyard that keeps the grass down. And the clothesline is just a piece of fencing wire with a prop stick. Only 20% of Aussie Street is under roof or paved, but there are as many people as most wall-to-wall modern suburbs. The floor area per person works out about the same as a tiny house each, but way more efficient. Time away from home is mostly work and school. No one has heard of greenhouse gas emissions, but retrospective estimates by those that lived through those years suggest it's about 30% of 2010 averages. The 60s and 70s was the era of rising affluence and additions, but also big changes in public services and infrastructure. The Water Board installs the sewer down the back of the houses in Aussie Street, so there's no more septic tanks to clean out and you can flush almost anything you like down the toilet. The council curb and channels the street and plants gum trees on what is now called the nature strip. At number 1, Fred has traded in the blue FJ for a new red EH. And Fred's sister has moved out after taking her vows as a nun. At number 2, they've filled in the back veranda and to create a TV room and separate rooms for the kids. Yes, and at number 3, Sid has split with his floozy, leaving Sue, who struggles to pay the mortgage, with Brian doing some mechanical work, but without most of his father's tools. After failing to keep up the mortgage payments, Sue is forced to sell. She and the girls move to the grandparents' farm. Brian gets a job, goes to night school, and boards with friends in the next suburb. The new owners, Greg and Ruth, are a bit younger and have 3 young children. And they're a lot more flash than Sid and Sue. The red gum is now huge, which Ruth loves, but she hates the greasy mechanic's garage. They knock down the garage and build a new double garage games room, concrete the drive, and plant native trees and shrubs everywhere. Mario and Angela are coming up in the world. They've bought their first car, and the neighbours are surprised when they knock down the veranda and build a brick semi-outdoor kitchen and entertaining area where they make pasta, salami and wine with the rellies. The veggie garden is now abandoned, but they get the tomatoes, meat and grapes from mates up on the Murray. The neighbours on the north side dobbed Mario in to the council for building without a permit. He had to get an engineer mate to certify the building and then planted a cypress hedge to screen out the nosy Parker neighbours. It's on the north side, but it certainly screened out the neighbours. Oh, and the olive grove has been reduced to 1. How come? Olives are really tough. Oh, that's right. Dino's younger brother left the goat tethered in the front yard and it ring-barked all the trees. And anyway, Angela was complaining that the kids don't help with picking the olives. So Mario cut down the trees, poisoned the stumps, but somehow one managed to grow back. Oh yes, back at number 3, Greg is spending a lot of time on his gym equipment in the games room. But after a health crisis, he starts a veggie garden in one of the few patches that still gets sun. After a couple of seasons, he gives up growing veggies because the huge red gum is sucking all the water and fertility from his garden beds. Then, in a windstorm, the red gum splits and crushes the hill's hoist. Ruth is heartbroken at the loss of the tree, but not the hill's hoist, which they, in any case, they replaced with a clothes dryer. Back at Harold and Marge's, Graham has left home and Lucy and Gerald are teenagers. Lucy's been reading Grassroots magazine and talking to Hilda next door about chooks. With help from Fred, she builds a chook house and starts her own flock. Of course, remember, her father, Harold, is not very practical. But her parents are a little bit worried about how much time she's spending with the chooks, and even wearing her carpenter's nail belt and hammer, which seems to them strange for a girl, and not spending enough time on her studies. Built area and paving has increased, while the number of people has gone down, and people are spending more time away from home. More time at home is in front of the TV. Greenhouse gas emissions have rocketed up with growing children and greater affluence. Greg's veggie patch and Lucy's chooks are small markers of the enthusiasm for self-reliance, including permaculture, that bucked the trend for a while in the 1970s. In the 80s and 90s, we have ageing at number 1 and number 2, a native forest garden overgrowing number 3, and infill development at number 4. Fred lost his job in corporate downsizing and is long-term unemployed until he can get the pension. He's drinking too much. They don't see Ethel very often because she does missionary work in New Guinea. As the 80s drifts on into the 90s, Fred has given up on the veggies, but is still active in the workshop. Hilda didn't replace her chooks after they were killed in a dog attack, but is still growing tulips. Fred still mows the dry grass in summer with the Victor lawnmower he bought in 1962. Harold and Marge are now empty nesters. Graham is married. Lucy moved to the country with her girlfriend. And Gerald moved out after his parents discover his dope plants growing in his sister's abandoned chook pen. They're not doing much with the place, neither is in good health, and the gum tree on the street has died. But Harold is talking about how much their place is worth and how they could move to a retirement village. Ruth's native garden has grown to a forest that encloses the house. The gutters are overflowing with litter and weeds. With the last of their children left home to go to uni interstate, they spend more time up north each winter in their mobile home. Inside the house, they do periodic renovations and the garage is full of their unused stuff. Mario and Angela have sold and moved to their new dream home in Doncaster. A builder-developer has bought the place to take advantage of the incentives for infill development. A 180 square metre brick veneer is whipped up and the surrounds paved with concrete. A quick reno on the old house and a drip irrigated ornamental garden completes the redevelopment. Oh yes, except for there had to be a stormwater detention tank installed under the driveway under council regulations to cope with the extra hard surface runoff. Don't know what it's good for, but it's there. Yes, so the builder sells to an absentee landlord who negatively gears the property against other investment income. The tenants in the new 4B are Rebecca and Nigel, a young working couple who love their dogs. Rebecca works in a bank branch on the other side of the city, and Nigel is an insurance salesman. At the renovated 4A, Vivian is a working mother with 2 teenage kids. Neither have been seen by the neighbours other than getting in the car each school day. Despite the new development between the old people, the commuters and the teenage couch potatoes, there's not much life left in Aussie Street. In terms of sustainability and resilience, these are the lost decades when consumption and economic growth were up, but community and the environment went down. Boring suburbia was becoming a self-fulfilling reality. In Aussie Street, the infill development did nothing to slow the loss of people and community interaction. The dream of the planners and the policymakers about better use of sewerage, better use of public transport and greater environmental efficiencies remained just that, a dream, if Aussie Street is any indication. Into the turbulent 2000s, a model of permaculture-inspired retro suburbia takes root at number 2 and spreads to number 3, while life drifts on at number 1 and number 4. Fred and Hilda are still there, not much happening outside except Hilda's tulips. They sold the car after Fred lost his licence, but he is still tinkering in the workshop. Harold and Marge have moved to a nursing home rather than the upmarket retirement village that Harold had envisaged. The house is rather derelict, with rotting boards in the porch and veranda, and is on the market for quite a while before it sells for slightly less than vacant land value, because of asbestos sheeting in the veranda or something. Alicia and Ollie managed to buy the place debt-free because of a small inheritance and some savings and the sale of Ollie's motorbike and massive vinyl record collection. Ollie is a permie who's mad keen to become an urban farmer. The old fruit trees surviving the drought with ripe apricots falling on the ground was the clincher for him. Alicia and Ollie are proudly car-free with their chrome alloy 10-speed tandem that is a far cry from Mario and Angela's heavy steel single-speed bikes in the 50s. So with little money but lots of energy, they start to transform the place. A rain barrel to collect roof water free of chlorine was the first retrofit on Alicia's to-do list, while Ollie focused on setting up his nursery in the old carport with plant stock on pallets down the driveway. He doesn't have a permit from the council, but it doesn't seem to be a problem. A permablitz helped infill the old orchard with subtropical evergreens, renovate Lucy's long-abandoned chook house, and add a new straw yard. Now, the Permablitz crew wanted to build a mandala garden, but Ollie has plans for a chook tractor market garden to produce mixed veggie boxes for sale. The chooks clear the weeds, pests and crop waste, fertilise and cultivate the soil, contained by an electronet temporary fence with successive planted crops in strips across the backyard. Ollie plants an almond and olive tree on the street verge, And after watching a YouTube by Brad Lancaster, he takes to the curb with an angle grinder to divert stormwater into a swale around each tree. The sandbag that diverts the water has to be lifted out when the street sweeper comes past, but it doesn't seem to be a problem. Oh, and a greenhouse attached to the chook house is a beauty. It's made from those folding glass doors from demolition of a 1960s petrol station. It increases Ollie's range of plant stock for sale and early season specials for his box customers. Next door is up for sale. It's more overgrown than ever, with Greg and Ruth away most of the time. Ollie's friend Gareth is scheming to get his parents, Ian and Andrea, to buy the place. Ollie is keen to see the trees go that are shading his market garden, while techhead Gareth has his eyes on the double garage for his metalworking and electronics projects. Andrea and Ian are open to the idea of moving after their failure to prevent a new apartment block being built that shades their passive solar house that they built in the 1970s. They can see the potential of number 3 for passive solar retrofit and extension if they cut down the big trees. They settle on a price with Greg and Ruth while only saying nice things about the native garden. With capital to spare from the sale of their place and savings from Ian's uni lecture job, Andrea's project management experience and Gareth's hands-on skill, stuff really happens fast at number 3. They hire Ollie to take down the trees using his climbing gear and chainsaw. Then a portable mill is used to salvage the timber. Plans for a passive solar addition made of light earth over a blue gum green hardwood frame are shepherded through the council with the help of a civil engineer friend. A workshop to teach light earth techniques sees the extension occupied, if not finished, in 6 months. A cool feature of the extension is a cool cupboard fed by an earth duct from the south entrance fernery. North and west pergolas are designed to shade the place from summer heat. And a large grid feedback solar installation on the garage and a modest planting of native insect and bird habitat shrubs down the back, partly to assuage Andrea's feelings of guilt about the backyard clearfell. Oh, and a veranda out the front, followed by a pizza building workshop and a street party organised by the young folks, is a sign of positive change in Aussie Street. Now, there was a debate about the gum tree on the street that was sucking all the moisture and nutrients from Gareth's half-hearted efforts at a front veggie garden. As a compromise, Ollie pruned the lower limbs to let more winter sun in while retaining the top canopy for summer shade. Of course, he was wearing his high-vis gear that made him look like a council worker. While the backyard clearfell was controversial with friends, once they'd moved into the new addition, Andrea and Ian started to feel guilty about having so much private space between the three of them. And the idea of taking in a boarder became the obvious opportunity that was good for the community, good for the household finances, and good for the environment. They interviewed a few prospective tenants, and Jodie, a single mum with a baby, moved into the front room of the original house. Now, there was a story on the street that Jodie and Gareth were a number. I don't know. Anyway, an extra young adult at number 3 changed the dynamics, and before long, Alicia and Jodie are sharing childcare and strategising. It was their idea to take down the boundary fence, which opened everyone's eyes to lots of possibilities they hadn't thought of before. Vehicle access to Ollie's market garden was an immediate benefit. Took a worsening of the drought, lots of planning and discussion, before the decision was made to build a 50,000 litre concrete tank across the boundary, fed by overhead pipes from both houses. It was finished and connected just in time to start filling in a summer thunderstorm. Other retrofits included a reed bed system to treat grey water from number 3 and later from number 2, greenhouse replacing the old porch at number 3, and later copied at a larger scale at number 2 to improve thermal comfort and grow more veggies seedlings for sale into the booming home gardening market. After the street tree did give up the ghost, the olive and almond planting from next door was replicated at number 3. Ah yes, and meanwhile over at 4A and 4B, things are rather staid. Rebecca and Nigel walk their dogs regularly, but they always have their earphones in, so casual conversations are difficult. They're often away overseas with the dogs in professional care. At 4A, there's a series of short-term tenants that the neighbours don't get to know. And the gum tree on the street is looking sick. There is more land covered by buildings, but for the first time, floor area per person is going down due to the extra people, who are also spending more time at home. Greenhouse gas emissions have dropped, not just due to the solar panels and the bicycles, but especially the home food production and frugal, home-based lifestyles. It's now 2025. The Australian property bubble collapsed in 2018. Mortgage distress, bank foreclosures, job losses, homelessness, and falling government tax revenues are creating hardship not seen since the 1930s. In Aussie Street, things are much better, although they do include some challenging changes before all 4 lots are buzzing with a revived household and neighbourhood non-monetary economy. At number 2 and 3, the systems put in place over the previous decade are really paying dividends. The kids are growing up with excitement and learning from parents and elders as they contribute to the household economy. Andrea and Ian are pleased to have invested the capital and time in supporting the next generation to create new livelihoods. Gareth is engaged in high-end industrial salvage and obtainium engineering projects that are helping urban agriculture, manufacturing and repair businesses start up without bank finance. Demand for Ollie's micro-urban farm produce is booming, but he can't feed the growing households at home and supply the demand for veggie boxes. For some years now, Ollie has been trying to get access to Fred and Hilda's backyard as an alternative to moving the market garden to a larger site. But Fred is still obsessed with mowing the dusty, bare ground. He's not doing it himself at this stage, but they're still there. He's getting it done. Now, Megan, one of Ollie's box scheme customers, is a nurse who strikes up a good relationship with Hilda, who reminds Megan of her own grandmother still living in provincial China, who she hasn't seen for many years. After Fred has an accident that confines him to a wheelchair, Megan gives notice on her rental lease and moves in as an informal carer. This relationship softens Fred's resistance, allowing Ollie to take over the backyard with the expanded chook tractor system. The extra growing space and a good growing season quickly triples his production. Connecting the house roof to the tank at number 2 is an easy retrofit that increases the yield of water for irrigation. A second-hand polytunnel is the next addition at number 1 that increases early and late season produce. Oh yeah, there it is. And Hilda's depression is eased by visiting the chooks in the backyard, scratching through the strips of spent crops. Megan is occupied with Fred's declining state. Homemade marijuana biscuits are keeping his pain at bay, but he is ready to go. And Hilda finds it so painful seeing him unable to move. After persistent pleading from Fred, Megan uses her medical contacts to get the necessary opiates, and Fred passes with Hilda and Megan's assistance. The funeral is a large one for someone with no surviving relatives other than his wife. Megan uses Fred's workshop to make a basic coffin from second-hand ply with some silky oak boards left over from the logging at number 3 to add colour. Working in Fred's perfect workshop for the first time stimulates Megan to start making bee boxes, and soon there are sweet-smelling hives in the front yard that don't seem to attract thieves the way unattended chooks do these days. Down at 4A, Nicole has been there for 2 years when a bank foreclosure sale sign goes up out the front. After getting nowhere with the real estate agent, she exchanges notes with Rebecca at 4B, who is now a branch manager and is personally obsessed with the property market. It turns out the new owner got the place for 50% of what Rebecca thought it would be worth. Rebecca wonders if her own bank is covering up big losses. She and Nigel have resisted buying their own place ever since the GFC because she thought property prices were going to crash. But until recently, it felt like they'd missed the boat of home ownership. And in any case, they'd spent a lot of their savings on overseas travel. Within a year, there's another forced sale sign goes up. Whoever bought it, apparently they couldn't keep up the payments either. And around the same time, Nicole loses her job. She can't afford to pay the electricity and the gas, and eventually the services are disconnected. Without a job and cold in the dark, she reluctantly moves into her boyfriend's apartment. Reluctant because his housekeeping standards don't match hers. 4A is now empty, and before long it gets vandalised. Nigel's insurance sales job is heading for the rocks, and Rebecca is talking about bypassing the real estate agent to make an offer to the current owner on the whole place. The day she contacts the owner to talk turkey, there's a fire. And by the time the fire brigade arrives, 4A is gutted. Now, the Photinia hedge out the front showed its fire retardant character by not burning, but somehow the sick gum tree on the street caught on fire, and one of the gung-ho firefighters decided it needed to be cut down. The fire brings people together on the street, but during the chaos of the night, Rebecca's dogs escape and somehow kill several of Ollie's chooks, which are now worth a fortune. Ollie has to be restrained, but is adamant that the dogs have to go because they'll do it again. For Rebecca, the dogs are her children, and after Ollie threatens to poison them, Rebecca and Nigel decide Aussie Street is not the place for them, even though it feels they were so close to owning what has been their home for decades. They decide to buy elsewhere and leave with their beloved dogs. The council contractor demolishes the shell of 4A, and before long the blackberries and weeds that had taken over the garden have colonised the rubble field. After a few months, the neighbours notice lights on in 4B. Rather feral-looking squatters on bicycles have moved in. The newcomers seem fairly quiet, and an Aboriginal flag covers the main window. Within weeks of the squatters moving in, another for sale sign goes up. After years of pestering by Andrea and Gareth, Ian has finally got his money out of uni super, but they're now worried that it's too dangerous to stash any more cash. And the government is planning to phase out cash, terrorism funding or something. With Rebecca's parting words, "Take your money out of the bank," ringing in their ears, Ian and Andrea buy number 4B and the rubble field for 20% of its peak value, complete with squatters. The squatters, Lisa, Kit, Lance and Seb, claim to be a bicycle repair collective, but have a hard anarchist outlook. They change from quiet to aggro about Andrea and Ian being up themselves if they think they own the place just because they exchanged worthless currency of a morally bankrupt capitalist state created for the benefit of the 1%. In any case, all property in this country was stolen from the Kooris. Lance tells them that he's a descendant of local Aboriginal clans. They are also full of disdain for Ian's electric car as a sign of the eco-bourgeoisie. Andrea and Ian find the squatters' attitude a huge challenge to their self-image of being on the side of the downtrodden and the dispossessed. But when the squatters discover that Gareth is an ace metal worker and has a MIG welder, their attitude softens. Of more immediate interest is Ollie's backyard farming operation, as competition for their usual food supply in the skips is getting intense, even ugly. Getting an ID card for rationed access to moles or bullies is out of the question. And the farmers' markets are just too expensive. Through their connection to the younger folks on the street, Lisa and Seb eventually establish a relationship with Andrea and Ian, who are still feeling a bit burnt. Gareth negotiates an in-kind rent agreement, leading to some modest retrofits. A greenhouse on the north side made of glass bricks, a water tank and a sump pump in the stormwater detention tank, and the squatters agree to keep everyone's bicycles maintained and repaired and confine all of their stuff to the house and garage. Because Alicia and Ollie's daughter Rihanna is mad keen to get goats on the vacant front lot. An electric fence is whipped up, and Alicia's long-time raw goat's milk supplier at the farmer's market provides a pregnant doe for Rihanna's 14th birthday present. Yeah, a bleating kid is soon the star of Aussie Street. But for security at night, the animals are locked in the new milking stall built over Ollie's old compost bays. Goat fodder is harvested around the neighbourhood from the overgrown gardens and the neglected council parks. Planting an almond and olive out the front symbolises the squatters becoming fully fledged members of the Aussie Street neighbourhood. The big change next door is when Gareth's pregnant girlfriend, Nisha, moves in, after she lost her job as a vet. They're planning a home birth, which would make their child a second-generation home birth baby, with Gareth born at home in the 80s. Down at number 1, Hilda sells the property to Megan for a nominal sum, but there's still a large land transfer tax to formalise the process. 6 months after Fred, Hilda is ready to die too. She manages without assistance by simply not eating. The funeral is even bigger than Fred's. Lucy, her teenage neighbour with the chooks, has kept in contact with Hilda over the years since her move to the country. Now in her late 60s, she is a prominent writer on ecofeminism and shocks everyone by revealing that she thinks Hilda was a lesbian who never came out. Young folks are enthralled by Lucy's stories of growing up in Aussie Street in the 60s. It amazes them that so much of what they are working to establish now existed in the 50s and 60s as a remnant of traditional self-reliance, but without the effort and excitement those behaviours now require and generate. Megan's recovery process really gets going when she employs young Jake from number 3 to help gut and renovate some of the rooms of the house. While his mum Jodie and Gareth were never partners, Gareth was a father figure to Jake and taught him about obtainium engineering and owner building. Replacing the decaying porch with an Aussie Street attached greenhouse, a new front veranda, and installation of a compost toilet, the main retrofits. Oh yes, and a grey water system modelled on the one at number 3. Megan sets the place up as an eco-travellers share house. With the travellers' help, Megan and Ollie increase production, add a grape pergola along the drive to Fred's workshop, which has been retained as a working museum of 1950s self-reliance. Between the focus on wood at number 1, the bicycle repair workshop at number 4, and Gareth's metal and electronics workshop at number 3, most stuff can be fixed and maintained on the street. Ollie contributes the last of his tree stock to a community planting at the local creek reserve, well protected from local goat herds. And he sets up wicking beds down the drive to increase veggie production. The old carport that has been the nursery for 20 years is enclosed in a light earth building workshop to create a rodent and thief-proof cool store, powered by an autonomous system set up by Gareth and Jake. Yes, the more challenging change at number 2, especially for Ollie, is that Rihanna's boyfriend, Kai, has moved in. He's a poet and a muso, and Ollie thinks he's a bit of a dreamer. Rihanna reminds her father of the time when he took her along to a talk by Nicole Foss, in which she suggested that people who could entertain might make a modest living in frugal futures. Kai's songs and guitar playing always entertain the residents of Aussie Street as they settle into doing less but enjoying life more. As Australia slides into the Great Depression of the 2020s, Aussie Street is humming. Not always sweetly, but it is humming. The number of people is back up to 1950s levels, but the floor area per person is still slightly higher, suggesting a few more could be accommodated, or maybe more home business activity. Although time away from home is already lower than it was in the 1950s. Now, some claim that it's the decline in the monetary economy that's the stick forcing people to stay at home in places like Aussie Street. But the vibrant household economy around the suburbs is also the carrot that's keeping people engaged. Now, according to Ian, greenhouse gas emissions in Aussie Street are down to 20% of 2010 levels. Now, keep in mind that the Depression itself has led to a 50% decline across Australian society. For the residents of Aussie Street, a lot of time away from home is outreach work to help others in the community achieve a graceful and necessary transition from dependent consumerism to permaculture-designed productivity. Apart from Ian trying to keep abreast of all the latest research, everyone is getting on with life and helping make the common sense of Aussie Street common again. I hope Aussie Street has inspired you to get your household economy humming and contribute to creating a new normal of retro-suburban self-reliance in your neighbourhood. Thank you. Well, it's hard to, yeah, there were no cats. Well, they're in the next houses further down Aussie Street, or over the back fence. Yes, the story is a little more elaborated in the short story version in the book. But Aussie Street has actually been just an oral story for over a decade, actually. I've been telling some version of this. When I first started it, there weren't even names for people. When I gave names to people, it sort of became alive. And then it was only in 2014, I think, I added that last scenario of the Second Great Depression. The story used to end with a question mark of what will happen next. And then when we wrote the story down for the book, it just sort of like ran away. I'd never had a writing experience like it. You know, there's all these connections and then this person's doing this with, and we had to chop it back and edit it back. So for me, Aussie Street is a sort of very real and you can fill in all the extra bits yourself.
I'm from the state government. I'd like to know what the state government can do to make it easier for people to do the things that you've described, what barriers there are that could be lifted or what encouragements could be given.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the first thing is really a conceptual framework that revises the regulatory structures that local government are forced to implement in controlling land use in residential areas. And this can apply actually beyond these residential areas. But firstly, in established areas, we need to make a distinction between activity that is done by householders, especially in property they own or with the agreement of the owner, and that activity which is done outside of bank finance. Because without bank finance, the things that happen tend to be small and slow and have limited, if they go wrong, they have limited adverse consequences. We should have a different set of regulations for things that are done in the monetary economy by business and especially with bank finance, because they happen faster, have larger scale and have greater knock-on consequences without the social licence regulation that can happen for householders. And then we need a completely different set of regulations when development is done by a non-natural person. Does everyone know what a non-natural person is? A corporation. Those regulations need to be strengthened, while the regulations that control what householders do need to be loosened. this sort of issue so often goes around, oh, there's one set of rules that everyone needs to agree to. Completely unjustifiable bullshit. You know, and it's about time that academics, you know, looked at this and looked at the evidence base for what is actually the risk consequences of, you know, someone with a backyard compost toilet compared with something done in a multi-storey development by a corporation doing its next development and then moving on to the next. So we, of course, we will see the consequences of that with things like the corruption of the building regulatory framework with apartment blocks, etc. The second thing that's really important would be the evidence base to show that by getting more people living in the existing housing stock, we could deal with a lot of the problems of urban of crowding or perceptions of crowding in our capital cities, and the cost of infrastructure that councils and government have to provide, whether that's public transport or sewerage or all sorts of things. So if we had more people living in the same buildings, we would also have more casual surveillance on the street, which reduces crime, that's well proven, and we would also have more community interaction, which would encourage more people to actually stay at home because those places are now interesting. So we have two historically unique conditions that make that strategy have enormous potential. The first is we have the largest houses and residential buildings in history with the lowest level of occupancy. I understand there's over 50,000 empty houses in Melbourne. In addition to that, there's 30,000 brand new apartments that are kept empty as mint condition to be flipped back onto the property market. So we don't have a property market, we have a casino. Houses are not built because of rising population. That's a complete minor factor. They're built because of an expectation that property just constantly goes up in value. Once it goes down in value, and people understand it's going to keep going down in value, the building bubble will break and there will be no more development. The only development will be retrofitting, or unless state and federal governments decide to get the taxpayer to fund the casino to keep going. Now, I can't discount that that could happen, but going back to the positive policies that could be implemented, by encouraging people to take in a boarder, they increase the household resilience to debt servicing and whatever. They encourage more social interaction, and it leads to more efficient households. By more efficient, by economies of scale. Cooking for 6 people is not much more work than cooking for 2. The huge amount of infrastructure which is sitting on standby where people are not using the buildings is also unprecedented and largely undocumented. So most houses are empty under lock and key while people are getting their lunch at a restaurant, going to the gymnasium, taking their dogs to the dog shampoo service. All of this extra infrastructure which has been built, which will mostly be unnecessary in a contracting economy. And therefore most of those businesses will go out of business as we move back to a spuds, beer and petrol economy. That's how I sort of, characterise, an economy of basics. Now, if you look at the amount of building stock that we have built, what's it going to be used for? Well, it can actually be retrofitted for housing. So we don't need to build any more housing. So the debate about are we going up at the centre with high-rise or out at the fringes or infilling all the established gardens with houses is a complete fake debate. We don't need to build anything more. Now you can see that my ideas for policies are never going to be adopted, because what would happen with these strategies of encouraging people to take in a border is that it would actually contract GDP. And I'm arguing that 50% of the GDP in my lifetime, I'm 64, is totally fake. Now, by that, I don't mean it's bads and disservices like legal litigation and car accidents, which all contribute to GDP. No, I mean that all that's happened is that its activity has been moved out of the household and community non-monetary economies and monetarised in the monetary economy. So when you go to work and buy your lunch instead of making it at home, no more lunches have been created. It's just been monetarised. So if that fake economic growth can be called economic growth, and all economists and academics and everyone has accepted that that's the case, we can move it back into the household and community non-monetary economies if it's better for the environment, better for community, better for people at all levels, and we can call it economic growth. So I am pro-growth. You see why I don't spend time on trying to get policy change at the state and federal level, but I think there's more potential for local government, despite its limited power, because it is the frontline interface with community, to take on some of these approaches. Now, I'm not discounting that there will be people at the state government level who do recognise these things. And it's interesting, when I was giving an early version of the Aussie Street story at Sustainable Living Festival in Melbourne, this must be nearly 10 years ago, this guy came up to me afterwards and he said, you know, you're taking a border strategy. That came up at a brainstorming session in the State Department of Planning, where I work, where we were looking at what are the opportunities for increasing urban density. And someone said, oh, you could encourage people to take in a border. And everyone in the room laughed in acknowledgement and then went back to discussing how to get Melbournians to accept more high-rise apartments and more infill development against, you know, their will. So maybe there's that native intelligence that recognised that although this would have all of these benefits, it would reduce GDP. So the take in a border strategy, obviously, firstly, if people understood that not only taking in a border was good for their finances, which is sort of self-evident, and people weigh that up against, oh, but my privacy and whatever. But if people at least knew that that was the most powerful thing they could do for their community and for the environment, more people might, you know, at least think about it and, you know, imagine the koala stamps they got for doing it. You know, so we don't even have the academic, you know, research and evidence base for local governments, let alone state government, to say, yep, here's the evidence that this will do all of these things. We're just claiming it. And again, you know, this has been my challenge to academics over the last decade, to actually look beyond the surface of the urban sustainability debate. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your question.
A lot of that rings really true with the, you know, how you set out the Australia Street, Aussie Street. Something but particularly I wanted to ask about, if you've come up against and how to then deal with, is council regulations. We live in this over-regulated world. For instance, here, chicken tractors go against council regulations. You technically aren't allowed to use a tractor. It has to be on concrete, which is ridiculous. And there's quite a lot of other regulations like that, including planting on your nature strip, which I've done and Amy here has done. And, you know, some of these things are really fundamental, like keeping chickens. Like
Yeah.
and then it's made to be very hard. How then do you?
The advice is very clear. Don't ask for permission.
I haven't.
And then be prepared to ask for forgiveness, and treat council officers as people just doing their job within the constraints of their job. The next level from that is to think about whether you have the social licence for what you're doing. Firstly, thinking about, okay, are there any problems with this thing I want to do in this particular situation? Who is likely to be affected in any way imaginable? And it's most likely going to be the neighbours. What is your relationship with the neighbours? So sometimes that social licence is harder to get than the legal licence, but it's really important in building that social glue that avoids the people ringing up the police or ringing up the council as a first line of response to something they don't like that their neighbours are doing. So this lack of social resilience in our community is probably our greatest weakness for the world we're moving into. And whether you think of that in terms of property bubble collapse created depression, like I illustrated in Aussie Street, or accelerating climate catastrophe, or geopolitical shocks to oil and other essential supplies. It doesn't matter how you look at it, the strong, greater resilience and understanding and give and take leading back towards the sort of self-governing communities. Now, I don't think when I say self-governing communities, I'm necessarily imagining a society without a police force or whatever. But we have an enormous amount of just day-to-day things that are effectively being institutionalised that need to be brought back down to that level. So that thinking about that social licence is important, and that of course is the insurance against being dobbed into the council by the neighbours, which is the primary way that these things become a problem. Of course, if you're building a second story on your house, it's a little bit different. And interesting example from Shani Graham, their place Ecoburbia in Fremantle is one of the case studies in the book. And they moved there from about 4 streets away from little 1920s working class cottages to up on the hill where there was 1970s and 1990s mansions. Gutted this Italianate very large house, 1970s house, and created 5 semi-autonomous apartments, all approved by the council and whatever. And Quarter Acre Block, where there would have been another mansion built on the back, they have chooks, veggies and goats in the backyard. Now they walk the goats around the neighbourhood, and a couple of the toffee neighbours in the next mansions up on the hill above them complained about the goats to the council. And then Shani got a petition as a result of spontaneous response from other people in the street who liked the goats, and they got 30 people within that street and block with a petition to council supporting the goats. And the council said, oh, we only have a process for accepting objections. We don't have a process for supporting things. Now, Shani has quite a strong connection with the council, and this was her encouragement for Fremantle City Council to actually develop a process for actually having the community support things as well. And she's an interesting example in that she's personally very radical and out there, but she's an ex-primary school principal and really good at just sort of engaging with people and very good at dealing with bureaucracy. You know, if you work in the education system, you've got to be good at dealing with bureaucracy. You know, so we still see that people on residential blocks. That is one of the spaces, apart from rural areas, it's one of the spaces in society where there's still a lot of latitude to be able to do things, whereas a lot of people in their jobs and other aspects of society are very much within some tight regulatory straitjackets that, as you say, are getting worse and worse. So we definitely need to break out of those, and it's also the role of people who are more public, like myself. We documented in our case study book of our property in 1995 our compost toilet in our garden shed, which is actually illegal. Now, I think there's a fine for every day of use of an illegal toilet. That toilet was built in 1992. But I see, like, the role of those who are more public out there is to help normalise these things so that lots of people who are doing these things under the radar can pop up, because that then can show other people that this is normal and reasonable. It also can show council, environmental health officers and other people that, oh, that's been operating there for 3 years and there hasn't been a problem. Oh, maybe we should look at that, because those are the necessary informal pilots which, if there was a process, would be approved on a provisional basis to see how it works before we let anyone do it. So that's an incredibly important R&D role that people who are doing those sorts of things are doing. Thanks. Keep at it.
Just in regards to what you can and can't do with council, we've set a precedent which council's not telling anyone about. When we subdivided internally 2 blocks away from here, any new development within Armidale must be connected to council's stormwater system. We argued that $100,000 to take the stormwater to Barney Street would have made the project non-viable. We now detain all our stormwater on site, which, gee, we're in water restrictions, so what? Which wasn't the reason, but it took us 12 months to convince council to do that, and in fact the runoff would actually be reduced, not increased, doing this development. So that's the first time in Armidale under current regulations that a house has been built without connection to stormwater. So it is possible. So you just have to have a good argument and good, legitimate facts and reasons for doing it, and council does have some flexibility.
So yes, that's a very interesting example, because again, there's a role for people who are doing something slightly more substantial and are prepared to put in the hard yards to make those precedent actions and make it possible for other people. Neighbours of ours got what we believe was the first legally approved compost toilet and reed bed in a sewered area in Australia in 1996. They were both scientists. They spent 6 months on it. They ended up having to put in a reed bed which was probably 4 times bigger than what was necessary. But yeah, those actions are important, but we need to look at a range of strategies from that type of careful working, just doing it quietly under the radar, and the more public direct resistance that some of us are prepared to do. So we need to work on all of those strategies and work out how we can work with people in council and recognise that there's ambiguous complementarities between that. I think there's also opportunity where councils, the progressive ones that are declaring climate emergencies, will find that they actually start to hit some structural difficulties. Are they going to just pursue trying to get almost everyone in the community adopt what the progressive 10 or 20% are already doing? Or are they going to think more creatively about what else can we do that doesn't necessarily come under that green, environmentally, socially progressive branding, like my Take In a Border strategy, for example. So things that will appeal to people who don't see we're in a climate emergency or think it's, a whole lot of hot air about not much. So that's important. I also see that the Aussie Street story is partly a bridge to those other people in the community who might see other reasons and motivations for these sorts of things.
Thank you. Look, it's a very interesting address, but I'm wondering why the permaculture industry has, or cult has sort of dropped off a very important thing, industrial hemp. Now, this brings together some of the figures and people and situations. Bill Mollison, of course, was right into that, and myself and others got the first legislation through in New South Wales. It wasn't done through the Greens at all. We had to set up an independent environmental group, stand for Parliament, and we nearly got in. But we got the legislation done through our local Member of Parliament here, Tony Windsor. But the point is that all these buildings, Kevin McLeod has put in 250 of these in Britain. Byron Council put a wall of hemp brick and so on, and Dr. Keith Cross from Southern Cross University did the work. Now, what has happened is that the entire environmental movement is missing the obvious things that are good. We've got fires, yet in hemp, industrial hemp, which can be grown for virtually nothing, it's fire resistant, it does all these things. So
happy to take that question, but recognising that it's outside the primary scope. I mean, of course, I could have illustrated instead of light earth that many people haven't heard of, it's actually a building technique that I actually have experience with. Certainly I've been in Ireland and Europe and seen hemp as a building material, and it has incredible potential, and like wood and straw is another way to sequester carbon in a permanent form, apart from all the other issues. But of course, most people sort of live in the suburbs in existing buildings. And as I pointed out, when this property bubble bursts, we won't have this vast building industry. We'll have what will have to be a very creative retrofit industry, which will suit small builders rather than corporate builders, which I think will be a great thing. And look, you know, we've just travelled across the Liverpool plains, and of course, when I'm dictator, of course, you know, we'll close down the cotton industry because we all have enough clothing, and you know, areas like the Liverpool plains will be growing food for people, not feedlot animals, because we will have closed all of those down as well as you know, various other things in ways that collectively will save half the water use in the country. And when we eventually need new clothes, we'll start up a hemp industry which doesn't need the fertiliser, the water, the pesticides that cotton needs. That being said, you know, just recognising that I've also been a very strong advocate all my life for sustainable forestry. And the blind spot in this country and in the environment movement about forestry and its potential, and in all the forms on farmland and in proper, sensible management of our existing forests, is a bigger blind spot in the environment movement than any lack of support for a possible hemp industry. I did actually write an essay back in the early 90s talking about what I thought were the benefits of hemp, but as wholesale replacement for trees as a way of growing paper fibre. You know, I'm actually a great supporter of sustainable forestry. Trees grow on really, really crap land that we have so much of in Australia, whereas hemp, by Australian standards, still needs arable soil. It doesn't need as good a soil as a lot of our other crops, but the context of saying hemp can grow on very poor land, that might match up for Europe or parts of Asia or North America. but Australian crapland that struggles to grow some grass, and grows gum trees and kangaroos is not and should not be turned into some imagined gigantic hemp industry. Now saying that, all I was doing was just toning down the huge enthusiasm there is by some people about hemp as a miracle crop. I think it is one of the world's great crops, but its role in a future sustainable Australia will be limited because we have so little arable land. But I should have said that's a question outside of Aussie Street, though. Sure, hemp retrofitting. Well, the cool store that they built could have been, maybe it was a hemp rendered cool store. And I can add that into a version of it.
Thanks, David. I remember in 1966 my dad said, "Don't tell anybody you've got a freshwater tank." What's that? It was completely illegal in one of the leafy suburbs in Sydney, but we lived off that water and did quite well. What I wanted to ask is in relation to networks. I can see now what you're saying about urban infill being a bit of a myth, but I'm wondering about the fact that we are currently constrained by these macro networks, including, for example, urban water supply, which is a big issue at the moment. Your Aussie Street example has quite a large, if you want to call it, agricultural water supply on site. And the same with micro energy networks that are popping up in Asia. What do you have to say about that as part of the future?
Well, in terms of food production, obviously Aussie Street is a microcosm of the retro-suburban strategy to effectively re-ruralise suburbia, that potentially suburbia can be capable with a combination of what's grown on private land and in public spaces could be net exporters of fruit and vegetables and small livestock products. Now, most of that export in a sustainable future food system should be into the inner city core areas that clearly cannot produce that. And obviously suburbia will still be dependent for grains and other broadacre agricultural products from rural hinterlands. But water is a constraint, there's no doubt about that. But if we look at the opportunities to reuse water, because quite a lot of water use in urban areas is not a consuming use like agriculture is, in that, if you put the water down the sink, then, it becomes grey water, so it has potential to be reused. And in addition to that, our urban areas shed enormous amounts of storm water. When we came to Hepburn in 1985, I already knew that the Murray-Darling Basin, including our river catchment of the Loddon, was over-allocated, apart from the threats of climate change that were already on the horizon then. And that the only new source of water was urban stormwater. Our dams catch urban stormwater, and that's the basis of us being able to support 180 fruit and nut trees and have really good fire defence in a town that's perhaps one of the most fire vulnerable towns in Victoria. So urban stormwater is an incredibly important resource, but I still think town water systems are a relatively low cost infrastructure, and some of the options that exist in cities like Adelaide would be to downgrade the town water supply to agricultural water, and that people are then using tanks for drinking water. Now, of course, under the current paradigm, that would been seen as going back to the third world sort of conditions. But it is difficult somewhere like Adelaide to collect enough water on a suburban block where you only get rain in the winter, whereas when you get to somewhere like Armidale and there is some summer rain and some winter rain, Usually, it looks like there hasn't been any for an awful long time. But, you know, that opportunity to use tanks to significantly contribute to backyard production is important. But we do need to recognise that water is basically cheap. The really important issue, which is a terrible conundrum for future generations, is the hugely expensive sewerage infrastructure, because that's taking away all the human nutrients, and at least somewhere like Armidale, it's going back into land. Where I've just been in Newcastle, a rapidly expanding city, there's this massive pipeline to the sea. And all of that infrastructure that directs that water to the primary treatment works. What are the options for future generations to close the loop and capture essential phosphorus back to food-producing land? Because that is the long-term, centuries-long killer for human civilization locked into centralised sewerage. Putting shit in water was a type 1 error of our civilization. Now, I don't know, maybe it will just be the backyard compost toilet. I certainly am very convinced that's one of the solutions. So some of these issues are well beyond the scope of retrosuburbia, which is focused on what people can do at home. But there is a chapter called Beyond the Boundaries, and in that we cut out a whole lot of material out of the book. You might think it's a big book, but we cut a lot of stuff out. And that's in an essay on the retrosuburbia website called Feeding Retrosuburbia from the Backyard to the Bioregion. And it's sort of more of that big picture of how what we do in the backyard and on the street verge and in community gardens in urban areas complements in developing a parallel bioregional sustainable food system. Because obviously, you know, all of those things are really important of how they work together.
Thank you, David. Retrosuburbia or Easy Street seems to have been driven by economic collapse or economic downturn, if you like. You know, whereas to me, permaculture was very much driven by vision and values. Is there a way that we can drive retrosuburbia through vision rather than just economic collapse?
Let's put it this way. Permaculture's always been informed by a dark view of the state of the world, but has always been focused on the positive solutions. One of the blind spots in our culture and society since I was at design school in the 70s is this very, very negative view of the suburbs. Right across our intelligentsia. Now, I don't want to blame Barry, Edna Edridge for that completely. It's really, you know, this whole view. So that is an illustration of that permaculture focus on that the problem is the solution. In a context of a particular event. But a lot of the people in Aussie Street, especially the people doing the permaculture retrofit in the 2000s, are motivated by environmental values, concern about greenhouse gas emissions, and most strongly, wanting to live a better life now and not accept all the bullshit that's put, that this consumer debt-laden treadmill that people are offered is a better life. I'm not motivated and never have been motivated by fear about collapse in society. But I have a big picture over the horizon view of these things that's always informed my work. We live this way because it's a better way to live. It's smarter, it's enlightened self-interest, and it comes out of values. But also have to recognise that history shows that the vast majority of people are shaped by what is the normal, socially, legally, culturally reinforced ways of doing things. And that they only change when there's some sort of crisis or shock or force. But this work is really not about how to encourage those people to be fearful. It's about galvanising those who want to have these values to get up and just create this new world now. So that is absolutely values driven. And I wouldn't be doing these presentations, I wouldn't have even bothered to write the book unless, you know, I had a sense that there's so many people out there doing this stuff. But to somehow normalise it as a new normal, and by normal I don't mean statistical majority, I mean it's just, this is a thing, this is how it happens. And that's what Shani Graham found in their Hulbert Street, radical sustainability street that was actually inspired by Aussie Street a decade ago. She said when about 20% of the people in their dead-end street were involved in the various activities and things that were going on in the street, the 80%, the vast majority, thought they themselves were now the minority. Now, the literature suggests in these sort of situations, it's when about 30% of people adopt some new behaviour, other people go, oh, you know, that's a sort of a thing. It's not necessarily that they all jump over and rush to it. Some will then have an interest, or at least an acceptance. There'll always be some who'll fold their arms and go, well, over my dead body, I'm never doing that. But that's what's needed, and so that's what we're trying to create, and that then gives a social insurance that you have a lot more people providing the examples that if we do have these crises, then these solutions are lying around, so to speak, close at hand, that can be copied.
Hello, David.
Yeah.
Thanks for being with us. The people on Aussie Street live very intertwined lives. How do they make decisions together and deal with the impending conflicts that will come?
Yeah, well, I tried to illustrate some of those things in Ollie's scepticism about his daughter's boyfriend moving in. Obviously, the most intense one was the squatters and the whole issue of land tenure and what does ownership actually mean. There is a chapter in the book about these issues. Obviously, decision-making in households, whether those are a family or a shared household, are very, very difficult issues. And as well as these structural impediments that don't want to see the redevelopment of household and community non-monetary economies because it would lead to a contraction in GDP, there's also the internal psychosocial impediments that are very, very deep in Australian society. We don't have much experience. And I think one of the difficulties is especially Australian middle-class people are reluctant to acknowledge their own power, and especially power in relation to other people, because we have this ideology that we're all equal. So, for example, as a homeowner, if you have a boarder in your house and you know it's not working out, and you have to say, look, at the end of your tenancy, I would like you to leave, you can't deny the fact that you have the power and they don't. And I believe some of us are so unwilling to face that we might even let a boarder in our house get the better of us because we're unwilling to exercise power that we have. So it's really complex, these relationships of decision making, and in the book we talk about different models. Shani Graham talks about that she and Tim are benevolent dictators with their tenants. You know, it's their place, and yes, those people have semi-autonomous households, but these are the rules. Other places, people have drawn in some of the experience in consensus decision making and shared, especially where you've got independent young adults, where there's no what I call natural authority, that someone has some authority, or at least in relation to some aspect. And then there's also the really universal issues of how within families different generations work together. Because what we're seeing in Australia is, with the economy still supposedly really good, because of the extreme unaffordability of housing, a lot of people are actually adopting the strategies that we know will be adopted if and when the bubble economy collapses. So there's already, you know, adult children moving back in to share house with their parents and navigating that space of how do we move from child-parent relationship, where both parties often see the other hasn't changed. And so many of us are familiar with that, where we go back to an old relationship and say, oh, that person hasn't changed at all. And maybe they have that same view of us, because we both go back to where we left off. So yeah, there's a lot of methodologies and ways of looking at these things that we mentioned, from holistic decision making, non-violent communication, where there's a lot of learnings, especially that have come out of the intentional communities movement, that I think can come back into the hopefully much simpler situations of just a household making decisions.
Everybody, thank David again.